scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George decided to play hide-and-seek in their house. The familiar yellow walls seemed different tonight, casting strange shadows that moved without any light source. Peppa counted to 10 while George ran to find the perfect hiding spot. When she opened her eyes, the house felt eerily silent. Peppa began searching through the rooms, calling George's name, but her voice echoed strangely. She checked the living room first, where the purple furniture sat motionless. But something was wrong with the family photos on the wall. In each picture, the smiling faces had been replaced with blank, staring eyes that followed her movement. Moving to the kitchen, Peppa noticed that all the cabinet doors were slightly ajar, creaking softly like breathing. The refrigerator hummed a low, haunting tune. Still no sign of George. She climbed the stairs to check the bedrooms, each step producing a hollow sound. In the children's bedroom, the toys scattered on the floor were moving slightly. The toy train was running its circuit without being wound up, and the teddy bear's head slowly turned to watch her. The drawings on the wall began to shift and change. Peppa called for George again, her voice trembling. From somewhere deep in the house came faint giggling that sounded like George, but distorted. Following the sound, she discovered a door painted the same yellow as the walls, making it nearly invisible. Behind the door was a long corridor that stretched much further than the house should allow. The walls were covered with family photos, but in these, everyone was crying black tears. The giggling grew louder as Peppa walked down the corridor. At the end, she found George sitting in a room that looked like their bedroom, but everything was wrong. The colors were too bright, the shadows too dark, and George himself seemed different. When he turned to look at her, his usual cheerful expression was replaced with an unnaturally wide smile. George spoke, but his voice came from everywhere at once. He told Peppa about other children who had played hide-and-seek in this house, children who had found this special room and decided to stay forever. The walls began to pulse like a heartbeat. As Peppa tried to run back, the photos on the walls began to move, showing her family in situations that had never happened. The corridor stretched longer with each step, and the giggling multiplied until it became a chorus of children's voices calling her name. Finally reaching the familiar part of the house, Peppa found Mummy and Daddy Pig in the living room, sitting perfectly still, staring at the television that showed only static. When she called to them, they turned their heads in perfect unison, their eyes reflecting the static. The house began to shift around Peppa, rooms rearranging themselves, doors appearing and disappearing. She realized she had become part of the game. As the episode ended, Peppa was seen standing at the front door, smiling that same unnaturally wide smile, waiting for the next family to move in. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. But something felt different today. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. Peppa's reflection in the mirror seemed to move just a fraction of a second after she did. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast as always. The familiar orange dress, the warm smile, everything seemed perfectly normal. But when Peppa looked closely at Mummy Pig's eyes, they seemed darker than usual, almost hollow. And when Mummy Pig smiled, it lasted just a little too long, stretching wider than it should. George came bouncing down the stairs, clutching his favorite dinosaur toy. But as he hugged it tight, Peppa noticed that the toy's plastic eyes seemed to follow her movements around the room. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. After breakfast, Peppa and George went outside to play in their garden. The familiar green grass and bright blue sky should have made everything feel normal again. But the other houses in their neighborhood looked different somehow. The windows appeared darker, like empty eye sockets staring back at them. When Susie Sheep arrived to play, Peppa felt relieved to see her best friend. But as they played their favorite games, Peppa noticed that Susie's laughter echoed strangely, lasting longer than it should. And when Susie turned her head, her movements seemed too quick, too jerky, like a broken toy. As the day progressed, more friends arrived to play. Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and Candy Cat all seemed normal at first glance, but each of them had something slightly wrong. Pedro's eyes never seemed to blink. Rebecca's ears twitched in patterns that didn't match any sound, and Candy Cat's purring continued even when she was speaking. The children decided to play hide-and-seek in Peppa's house. As they scattered to find hiding places, Peppa noticed that their footsteps echoed differently than usual, as if the house itself had changed shape. The familiar rooms seemed longer, and doors appeared in places where walls used to be. When it was Peppa's turn to seek, she began counting to 10. But as she counted, she heard other voices joining in, voices that sounded exactly like hers, but came from empty rooms. The counting grew louder and more distorted with each number, until it became a chorus of Peppa's voice echoing throughout the house. As evening approached, Peppa and George sat in their living room with Mummy and Daddy Pig. The familiar purple sofa and green walls should have felt comforting, but the shadows in the corners seemed to move independently, and when the family spoke, their voices seemed to come from slightly behind them. That night, as Peppa lay in her bed, she could hear George breathing in the bed next to hers. But the breathing seemed too rhythmic, too perfect, like a recording playing on repeat. And when she looked toward his bed in the darkness, she could see two small points of light where his eyes should be, glowing softly in the dark. Peppa closed her eyes tight and tried to sleep, but she could feel that something fundamental had changed in their world. Everything looked the same, everyone acted the same, but nothing was quite right anymore.
Peppa Pig. The drawing that wasn't hers. It all started on an ordinary Sunday morning. The sun had just begun to filter through the curtains, and the room was quiet. Peppa stretched, jumped out of bed, and, as always, walked to her desk. She wanted to draw something for school, but there was already a sheet of paper on the table, perfectly drawn. In the center, the kitchen. She was standing there. George sat at the table. Daddy Pig was pouring tea. Mummy Pig was holding toast in her hoof. Everything looked familiar until one detail. A broken teacup lay on the floor, clearly drawn, with shards, even a drop of tea nearby. "I didn't draw this," whispered Peppa. She glanced around. George was still asleep. Her colored pencils were neatly packed in their box. The paper was clean, unwrinkled. No one could have faked her style, but the handwriting, it felt strangely familiar. At breakfast, she said nothing. She just remembered the scene, and everything happened exactly the same. Daddy Pig's exact words, "The morning starts with tea." Mummy's same smile, and the teacup slipping and shattering on the floor, just like in the drawing. "Coincidence," she mumbled, but her heart beat faster. The next morning, another page. It was already waiting on her desk. The scene, a walk in the yard, George with his ball, she had her kite, and in the background, a puddle she was about to fall into. She tried to avoid it, but everything happened just as in the drawing. Even George's shout was the same. The third drawing was worse. Their bedroom, nighttime, and next to George's bed, a figure, dark, vague, just a silhouette, sketched in soft pencil. Peppa stared at it for a long time. She wanted to tear it up, but her hand wouldn't move. "Who's doing this?" she asked the mirror. "Who's drawing?" That night, she couldn't sleep. She listened to every sound. At 2 a.m., George moaned. She got up, walked over, and saw a shadow at the door, exactly like the one in the drawing. It vanished the moment she blinked. This can't be real. Each day, the drawings got darker. One showed her standing alone, her family behind her, all with empty eyes, and above them, a message. "You didn't notice, but they've changed." She tried hiding the drawings, in a drawer, under the bed, even in the storage room. But every morning, a new sheet was on the table, always fresh, as if someone placed it there during the night. On the 7th day, she woke up early, waited, lay with her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, and heard it. The soft rustle of paper, a faint wooden creak. Someone was in the room, someone breathing quietly. She opened her eyes. No one there. Just the new drawing. In it, herself, sitting at the desk, reading the very drawing she was holding. And behind her, a hand, long, drawn in black chalk. She was turning her head, and the drawing ended there. The final line trembled as if the artist had been interrupted. Since then, Peppa can't sleep soundly. She's afraid not just of tomorrow morning, but of the one who already knows it, the one drawing her life, step by step, and coming closer, because the last drawing she saw was blank, just one silhouette, faceless, with a message below. Your turn to draw.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy Saturday morning when Peppa and her family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's old attic to look for forgotten treasures. The wooden stairs creaked ominously as they climbed up, and the air grew thick with dust and something else, something that made their skin crawl. Grandpa Pig had warned them about the old music box he kept up there, the one that played by itself sometimes. But Peppa, being curious as always, immediately spotted the ornate golden box sitting alone on a dusty shelf. When she opened it, a haunting melody began to play, and a tiny ballerina started spinning inside. The melody was beautiful at first, but as it continued, the notes became distorted and wrong. The ballerina's painted smile seemed to grow wider with each turn, and her tiny porcelain eyes appeared to follow Peppa around the room. George tried to close the box, but it wouldn't shut. The lid seemed to be stuck open by invisible hands. As the music played, the family noticed that their reflections in the old mirrors scattered around the attic were moving differently than they were. Mirror Peppa was dancing to the twisted melody, while Mirror George was crying tears that looked like black ink. Mirror Mummy and Mirror Daddy were reaching out from behind the glass, their mouths moving as if trying to warn them about something terrible. The temperature in the attic began to drop rapidly, and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. The music box melody grew louder and more chaotic, and other objects in the attic started moving on their own. Old photographs fell from their frames, revealing blank faces where family members should have been. Peppa realized that the music box was some kind of trap, designed to pull them into the mirror world where everything was backwards and wrong. The mirror versions of themselves were becoming more real, while the real family was becoming more like reflections. They had to escape before they became permanently trapped in the glass. Working together, the family tried to smash the mirrors, but each broken piece only created more reflections, more wrong versions of themselves. The only way to stop it was to find the key that would finally close the music box. Grandpa Pig remembered hiding it somewhere in the attic decades ago, but where? As the haunting melody reached its crescendo, they discovered the key hidden inside an old teddy bear. With trembling hands, Peppa inserted the key and turned it, finally silencing the cursed music box. The mirrors returned to normal, the cold disappeared, and their reflections became their own again. But as they hurried down from the attic, Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them down. And late that night, she could swear she heard that twisted melody playing softly from somewhere in the house, growing closer to her bedroom door.
The scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV late evening at the Pig family house, unusual silence reigned. Mummy Pig finished washing dishes and turned off the light, while Daddy Pig slept in his chair. Peppa and George prepared for bed in their bedroom with the purple bunk bed. George climbed onto the bottom bunk with his dinosaur, while Peppa climbed to the top. But tonight, something was wrong. The bed made strange creaking sounds. Every time Peppa turned, the metal parts creaked eerily. Mummy Pig wished good night and turned off the light. As the room plunged into semi-darkness, the bed began rocking by itself. Peppa felt her bed slowly swaying, as if an invisible hand pushed it. George noticed the movement too. His bed rocked in the opposite direction. The children looked at each other fearfully, deciding it was wind. They tried sleeping, but the swaying continued. At midnight, Peppa was awakened by quiet whispers. "Peppa, Peppa." The voice came from below, but wasn't George's. Peppa looked down. George slept soundly, hugging his dinosaur. The whisper repeated near her ear. "Peppa, come down." She woke George. The boy heard the voice calling him. "George, come up." The children realized something terrible was happening. The voice grew insistent. The bed rocked harder. The ladder began moving by itself, inviting George to climb. Peppa and George huddled together in terror. Strange sounds came from dark corners, grinding, whispering, quiet laughter. Suddenly the bed stopped abruptly. Deathly silence fell. Seconds later they heard footsteps in the corridor. The door creaked open. A dark figure appeared, too tall and thin. It entered and approached the bed. The figure extended a long arm toward the ladder and shook the bed. "Switch places,"